"I've been on this bench longer than you've been out of college," he sneered, each word laced with the quiet arrogance of a man too long unchallenged. "You're not here to educate me, Miss Crockett." The courtroom chuckled, nervously, obediently. To most, it sounded like a harmless jab. But for those who had stood too many times in rooms like this, rooms lined with portraits of power, but rarely of justice, it was a familiar sound, the sound of dismissal. What Judge Andrew H. Stones didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to educate him. She came to expose him, not with fury or grandstanding, but with the quiet, terrifying precision of someone who had studied not just law, but injustice. She didn't flinch, didn't argue. She just blinked once, slowly, because that was the moment she knew he had already lost. What followed would not be a debate. It would be a reckoning. And it began, like all storms do, not with thunder, but with silence. It was 8:47 a.m. when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped into the federal courtroom of Judge Andrew H. Stones. The courtroom itself, though air-conditioned and polished with mahogany trim, felt cold, sterile in the way only institutions built on tradition and exclusion can feel. The faint smell of varnish hung in the air, mingled with the sharper edge of overbrewed coffee and the quiet tension of unsaid things. The morning sun filtered in through tall, narrow windows, casting harsh white light onto a room where history had rarely been kind to those who looked like her. Jasmine didn't flinch as the doors closed behind her. She moved slowly, deliberately, her heels echoing against the marble floor like a steady drumbeat, a call to attention. Her suit was burgundy, sharply tailored, but her presence was what turned heads. There was something electric in the air as she approached the plaintiff's table, something the spectators, the court reporter, even the defense attorneys couldn't quite place. She wasn't here to perform. She wasn't here to plead. She was here to reveal. Across the courtroom, Judge Stones adjusted his robes and looked down from his bench. A silver-maned man with the weight of 2 decades in power etched into the lines around his eyes. Stones was known for cutting lawyers down with a glance. He didn't believe in nuance, only hierarchy, and he made his position clear with the smugness of a man who had never truly been challenged. His voice boomed through the chamber as Jasmine placed her briefcase on the table. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his tone half curious, half dismissive. "Let's see if you brought more than political theater with you today." The room chuckled lightly, but Jasmine's face didn't change. Not a blink, not a twitch. Only her eyes, those sharp, discerning eyes, moved. They scanned the gallery, the jury box, and finally locked on the judge. And though she said nothing yet, her silence screamed what everyone in the room would soon understand. This was not just another civil rights lawsuit. This was the beginning of something much, much bigger. And she had come prepared, not just with facts, but with fire. Hidden in her briefcase was a folder thick with truths no one had dared speak in this courtroom before. Not until now. Judge Andrew H. Stones leaned back in his chair, the sound of his leather squeaking as he did so. He was a master at intimidation, and today he was savoring his moment. As Jasmine Crockett began to present her case, a small flicker of amusement crossed his face. He adjusted his glasses, peering down at her from his lofty position on the bench, and then, with a subtle smirk, he interrupted. "Sorry, Ms. Crockett, but I believe you meant to say the defendants, not defendants," he corrected, mispronouncing her name with deliberate condescension. "It's Crockett, not Crockett," he added, his voice laced with mocking sweetness. The courtroom chuckled quietly. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even look down at her notes. Instead, she paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the judge. She had expected this. This was nothing new. This was the exact kind of treatment she had endured before, during her years as a public defender, fighting tooth and nail for the people society often turned its back on. She knew the game. It was the same game that had been played countless times before. Dismiss her, belittle her, distract her, tire her out. The system wanted to break people like her, to make them lose themselves in the noise and the chaos of the courtroom. But Jasmine was no stranger to this. Silence fell between them for a brief moment, thick and suffocating. Jasmine's lips barely moved as she spoke, but her words cut through the air like steel. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I'm here to speak the truth. I will not let you silence me." Stones waved her off dismissively, his tone growing sharper. "I didn't ask for a lecture, Miss Crockett. Just get on with it." But Jasmine stayed calm. She could feel the familiar tension in her chest, like a coil winding tighter and tighter. It reminded her of her early days as a public defender, when judges like Stones would laugh her off, when they tried to crush her every step of the way. But back then, she had learned something important: patience. The kind of patience that allowed you to observe, to listen, to wait for your moment. And now that moment was coming. With each condescending remark, each interruption, Jasmine's resolve hardened. She had been underestimated before. She wasn't about to let it happen again. The night before the hearing, the lights inside Jasmine Crockett's congressional office burned well past midnight. The city outside had gone to sleep, its traffic slowed to a hush, its skyline blinking drowsily in the darkness. But inside that room, time had folded in on itself. Stacks of documents lay sprawled across the desk like a battlefield. Every folder a story, every highlight a wound, every margin note a silent scream for accountability. She sat still, back straight, eyes sharp behind her reading glasses, as the faint hum of the old radiator filled the silence like background noise to a ritual. The clock on the wall read 1:43 a.m. She had barely moved in hours, save for the occasional sip from a half-cold mug of coffee. On her screen, the name Judge Andrew H. Stones appeared again and again, 12 different times across 5 years. 12 different cases, all centered on civil rights complaints. And one unifying thread: dismissiveness, bias, and judicial arrogance disguised in legal decorum. Jasmine had highlighted every pattern: his language, his rulings, even his body language in court transcripts. This wasn't just a judge with a poor record. This was a man protected by tradition, emboldened by decades of unchecked authority. And now he was about to preside over a case where the stakes weren't just legal, they were moral. She leaned back, eyes scanning the table one more time, until her gaze rested on a particular folder. Thicker than the rest, wrapped in a red elastic band. It was her own compilation, a curated weapon of truth. Each document inside wasn't just evidence, it was context, perspective, memory, pattern. She slid it into her leather briefcase with quiet care, as if she were sealing a time bomb. As she zipped it closed, she paused. Her fingers rested for a moment on the handle. She wasn't nervous, not anymore. She wasn't even angry. What she felt was deeper, like gravity, pulling her forward into something inevitable. She stood slowly, turning out the light, and whispered to herself, not with arrogance, but with absolute clarity, "Tomorrow I won't just speak. I'll make America listen." And with that, she left the office. One woman, one folder, one mission to challenge an empire that had grown far too used to the sound of its own voice. By the second day of the hearing, it was no longer subtle. Judge Andrew H. Stones wasn't just presiding, he was performing. With every mispronunciation of Congresswoman Crochet, every theatrical sigh, and every scoff thinly veiled as judicial impartiality, he turned the courtroom into his own personal stage. He interrupted Jasmine so consistently it felt rehearsed. "Miss Crochet," he'd say again, letting the syllables fall like a jab, "let's not turn this courtroom into a press conference." The irony, of course, was lost on no one. It would have almost been comical if it weren't so brazen. Each time Crockett presented an exhibit, documented closures of polling places, graphs of disenfranchisement trends, affidavits signed under oath, Stones waved them away with a flick of his hand, like a monarch disinterested in the pleas of peasants. "Speculative," he declared, "irrelevant, borderline inflammatory." No matter how methodically sourced or legally sound, he buried her evidence beneath a mountain of judicial ego. The courtroom, for all its marble and formality, had become a playground for condescension, and Stones played the tyrant with flourish. At first, the crowd responded with uneasy silence, but gradually the tension became unmistakable. Reporters shifted in their seats, exchanging sideways glances. A man in the third row, a retired judge perhaps, narrowed his eyes as if trying to remember when due process had turned into improv theater. Even the defense attorneys, smirking just hours earlier, began to avoid eye contact with the bench. The air was thick, not with drama, but discomfort, like watching a man in power throw gasoline on his own legacy while mistaking the match for applause. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett sat unmoved. She took notes neatly and without haste. She didn't flinch when Stones laughed, didn't react when he cut her off. She simply wrote names, times, specific phrases. Her pen moved with the quiet patience of someone not looking for a reaction, but building a record of arrogance, of patterns, of behavior too consistent to be coincidence. The courtroom saw it as disrespect. Jasmine saw it as data. What Stones failed to grasp, what made him dangerous, wasn't just that he was biased. It was that he believed he was untouchable. He thought this was his room, his moment, his throne. But he was wrong, because while he ruled from the bench, Jasmine Crockett was drawing the blueprint for a courtroom revolution, and she hadn't even opened the red folder yet. It began with a tablet. Jasmine Crockett stood at the plaintiff's table, calm and composed, holding up a device that contained damning footage, security camera clips from 3 separate polling locations, each showing eligible voters, mostly black, mostly elderly, being turned away under flimsy pretexts. Quiet confusion, doors closed too early, ID rules twisted just enough to deny access. The kind of footage that wasn't flashy, but undeniable. And it was all time-stamped, cross-verified, and legally admissible. Your Honor, she said clearly, we'd like to submit this video evidence as documentation of real-time voter suppression. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. The truth was loud enough, but before the court reporter could lift her fingers to resume typing, the defense leapt in. Objection. Prejudicial. Out of context. Inflammatory. Judge Stones didn't even look at the screen. Sustained, he said with a casual wave. Move on, Congresswoman. Jasmine tried again, this time stepping forward. This footage directly supports our claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. These are not hypotheticals. I said move on, Stones interrupted louder this time, his tone barbed with finality. Unless you've got something more substantial than amateur dramatics. Then he laughed, not a chuckle, not a courteous courtroom grin, a full, throaty laugh that rolled through the chamber like a slow explosion. It echoed off the walls, the marble, the silence of those watching. This is a court of law, Congresswoman, he said between breathy chuckles. Not some episode of Law and Order, activist unit. That was the moment. The gallery didn't breathe. The defense attorneys looked suddenly uncertain. A young journalist stopped her recording mid-scroll. Even the court clerk shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Jasmine didn't blink. Her arms lowered. Her expression didn't twist, but her entire presence changed, quietly, sharply. The fire in her eyes didn't erupt. It focused. No more restraint, no more studying. Her patience had run its course. Because that laugh, it wasn't just mockery, it was proof. Proof that this judge didn't just disregard civil rights. He ridiculed them. And Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for precisely that moment to begin turning the courtroom upside down. Your Honor, Jasmine said, her voice crisp, steady, like the beginning of a verdict. Before we proceed, I respectfully request the court's attention to a matter of procedure. Judge Stones waved a hand without looking up. If this is another detour into political theater, I'll remind you. But Jasmine was already reaching down, slow, deliberate. Her hand slid into her briefcase and emerged with a thick red folder bound with a single black elastic band. The motion was quiet, but it landed like thunder. The court, she continued, should be made aware of patterns that call into question this bench's ability to rule impartially on civil rights matters. Stones straightened slightly. The room leaned forward. She opened the folder. Morrison Veers, Texas Secretary of State, 2023, she began, dismissed on procedural grounds. But according to transcript, she held up a printed page. You told the plaintiff's attorney, maybe stick to personal injury and leave constitutional law to grown-ups. A hush fell across the room like a dropped curtain. Stones shifted. Henderson versus Texas Board of Elections, 2022, she continued. You dismissed the case and sanctioned the attorneys for media posturing. Those sanctions were overturned on appeal. The Fifth Circuit noted your comments were, quote, inappropriate and suggestive of bias. She turned another page. Jackson v. Harris County, 2021. You interrupted closing arguments to say, and I quote again, stop wasting this court's time with conspiracy nonsense. That ruling was reversed. The plaintiff was vindicated. Gasps now. Audible ones. Reporters began scribbling furiously. One camera clicked. Though flashes were prohibited, no one seemed to care. She wasn't done. Thompson versus Texas legislature, dismissed after you advised plaintiffs to, quote, find a hobby other than suing the state. The Judicial Conduct Board issued a reprimand. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. Each name she spoke landed like a blow from the very gavel Stone's clutched so tightly now that his knuckles paled. Jasmine Crockett wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. She had shifted the courtroom's gravity, and for the first time in his career, Judge Andrew H. Stone's looked like a man being judged. Let the record reflect, Jasmine Crockett said, holding aloft another sheet of transcript, that Judge Andrew H. Stone's has exhibited a consistent pattern of judicial bias and contempt toward civil rights litigation. Well documented, well known, and, until now, unchallenged. She turned to the next case. Williams v. Texas Department of Public Safety, 2020. The plaintiff alleged racial targeting in highway patrol stops. The evidence was substantial, but the case was dismissed with prejudice. Why? Because you, Your Honor, stated during proceedings, and I quote, I'm not interested in turning this courtroom into a debate club for social grievances. That ruling was reversed. The appellate court found the dismissal premature, and the language used by the bench, quote, dismissive and inappropriate in the context of serious constitutional claims. Judge Stone's shifted in his seat, the gavel now resting limp in his hand like a symbol he no longer fully controlled. Crockett moved on, unrelenting. Let's go back to Morrison, 2023. You may remember telling counsel, this case sounds like something you cooked up after watching a protest documentary. That statement alone drew scrutiny from two federal law professors and was cited in an editorial titled, When Judges Stop Listening. You remember that piece, Judge? The one that called your ruling a textbook example of systemic bias cloaked in procedural armor? She held up a laminated copy of the editorial. Stone stared at it blankly, blinking like a man watching pieces of his legacy being peeled away in real time. Henderson, 2022. Again, the case was dismissed, but this time you went further. You issued sanctions against the plaintiff's attorneys for pursuing what you called frivolous activism. Those sanctions were overturned. The appeals court specifically noted your language as, quote, indicative of personal bias unbecoming of the federal bench. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of paper and the occasional click of pens. The defense team whispered urgently, their confidence evaporating. Even the court clerk had stopped typing, her eyes fixed on the woman calmly reciting a decade's worth of buried truths. These aren't isolated incidents, Your Honor, Jasmine continued. This is a pattern, a documented trail of disregard. And today it stops being silent. Each sentence landed like a judicial indictment. Stones looked down at the documents now piling on his bench, not as a judge receiving exhibits, but as a man watching his reputation hemorrhage, page by page. By now, the courtroom had transformed. Reporters, who at first had taken sparse notes between distracted glances, were now scribbling furiously, flipping pages, eyes wide, jaws clenched. Their pens moved with the rhythm of revelation, chasing every quote, every citation, every ripple of disbelief. One journalist leaned so far forward from the press box that her recorder nearly fell from the ledge. At the defense table, the once confident attorneys now looked like rookies at their first trial. One of them fumbled for a document that wasn't there. Another whispered something behind clenched teeth to a colleague, who stared straight ahead as if contact with Crockett might turn him to stone. And in the gallery, silent for so long under the heavy etiquette of courtroom decorum, a sound began to emerge. It was barely audible at first, a pair of hands clapping once, twice, then quickly hushed as if the very act had broken an unspoken rule. But it had happened. Applause, however brief, inside a federal courtroom. It said what no one dared speak aloud. Someone was finally holding power to account. Judge Stones heard it. He noticed everything now. His face had shifted from stern to strained. The color drained, then rushed back in a wave of red that bloomed across his cheeks and ears. He reached for the gavel but didn't bring it down. His hand trembled, just slightly, but enough to be seen, enough to be remembered. Because for the first time in 2 decades, he was no longer the center of control. Jasmine Crockett was still standing, still composed, still steady. She made no gestures, raised no voice. Her words carried the full weight of legitimacy, and it was that weight, not volume, that shook the room. It wasn't just her evidence. It was the fact that no one, no journalist, no lawyer, no member of the public was interrupting her. They were listening to her, not the robe, not the smirk, not the gavel, to her. And the unspoken question in every eye was no longer, can she prove it? It had become, how deep does this go? For Judge Andrew H. Stones, the room had stopped being his. And for Jasmine Crockett, the fight had just reached its crescendo. Jasmine Crockett took one final breath, not out of nerves, but to steady the gravity of what she was about to do. The courtroom remained silent, frozen in the stillness that follows a storm and anticipates the next. Stones sat motionless behind the bench, eyes unfocused, his mouth pressed into a thin, uncertain line. All the weight that once came so effortlessly with his title now seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders. Jasmine looked directly at him. "Your Honor," she began, voice unwavering, "I move that this court recuse itself from these proceedings on the grounds of demonstrated bias and an extensive record of prejudicial conduct in civil rights cases." The words didn't come out like an accusation. They came out like a judgment already passed. "I further move," she continued, her tone sharpening, "that this case be reassigned to a judge whose record reflects the impartiality required by both law and conscience." There was no gasp this time, only a collective exhale, as if the entire room had been holding its breath, waiting to see if she would cross the final threshold. She had. Judge Stones blinked slowly. The gavel sat untouched before him, as inert as the authority he once wielded. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She turned back to the gallery, her voice not rising in volume, but in resonance. "Because justice," she said, "has no room for arrogance and truth," she paused just long enough to let the weight settle, "bows to no gavel." The sentence hung in the air like a bell tolling through the walls of the institution itself. Even now, no one moved. No one dared. Judge Stones stared at her. Whatever instinct had once driven his confidence, his smirks, his laughter, his careless dismissals, had long since vacated. In its place stood only the silent realization that history might remember this moment not as his ruling, but as her reckoning. His hand moved toward the gavel, not with command, but with resignation. His voice, for the first time that day, sounded human. "Court is in recess." A soft tap, one echo, then silence. And with that, the courtroom doors to justice began to creak open, on their own terms, and finally in the right direction. It didn't take long. By the time the courthouse doors had shut behind Jasmine Crockett, the outside world had already begun to catch fire. Within minutes, clips from inside the public gallery were circulating across social media. The hashtag number sign Jasmine versus Judge began to trend before Judge Stones had even left his bench. It started with short, shaky videos recorded discreetly from the gallery. Her calm voice, his trembling hands, that final sentence about truth and gavels. Then came the edits. TikTok users added cinematic music over her speech, overlaying captions like, "This is how justice speaks," and "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the bar." Within hours, millions had seen it. On Twitter, journalists and lawyers weighed in. Unprecedented, historic. She dismantled him with nothing but documents and dignity. One user called it a modern-day courtroom revolution. On Instagram, carousel posts walk through the highlights like play-by-play recaps of a championship game. Side-by-side comparisons show Judge Stones laughing in one frame and Jasmine unveiling case files in the next. The memes came too. Sharp, viral, celebratory. Cable news anchors spoke with a kind of reverence usually reserved for election nights or landmark rulings. CNN ran the headline, "Congresswoman brings down the gavel on federal bias." MSNBC called it a pivotal moment for civil rights jurisprudence. Even on Fox News, commentators couldn't agree whether she had overstepped or simply exposed what had been festering for years. But they all played the clip, on loop. Talk shows re-aired her words. Justice has no room for arrogance, and truth bows to no gavel. The quote was printed on posters, turned into T-shirts, and etched into protest signs overnight. At barbershops, cafes, classrooms, and kitchen tables, people talked not just about the moment, but what it meant. For young attorneys, it was proof that preparation could topple power. For civil rights activists, it was validation that the fight had a future. For older Americans who'd seen decades of courtrooms tilted by quiet prejudice, it felt like a correction long overdue. It didn't matter that it had started with a mispronounced name and a smirk. What mattered was that the whole country had heard the sound of a system being confronted, and this time, it couldn't laugh its way out of it. The courtroom may have gone quiet, but the institutions were just starting to wake up. In the weeks following the confrontation, Jasmine Crockett's phone never stopped ringing, not from journalists or campaign donors, but from law schools. Invitations poured in. Harvard, NYU, Howard, Berkeley. They didn't want her for a photo op. They wanted her at the podium, walking students through the anatomy of what had just happened. Guest lectures titled "Documenting Judicial Bias," "The Gavel Isn't God," and "Truth as Legal Strategy" filled auditoriums to capacity. For once, aspiring lawyers were learning not just the law, but how to confront it when it hides behind robes. At the institutional level, the tremors ran deeper. The Judicial Conduct and Disability Committee, quiet for decades, announced a full review of 12 prior civil rights cases previously handled by Judge Stones, starting with Morrison and Henderson. Several had been dismissed quietly, buried under vague procedural language. Now they were being dusted off, re-examined with scrutiny, and in some cases, reopened. The American Bar Association, ABA, once slow to respond to internal judicial complaints, issued a formal statement. Congresswoman Crockett's presentation demonstrates the critical need for stronger ethical oversight in our federal judiciary. The Department of Justice followed suit. Internal memos proposed new standards for judicial accountability, including mandatory bias training and standardized review audits of civil rights rulings. And then came the biggest shift of all, the Crockett Protocol. It started as an outline, just a PDF she had distributed during one of her law school talks, showing her method for tracking bias across rulings, language patterns, reversal rates, attorney sanctions, courtroom behavior. But legal advocacy groups quickly adopted it. Within a month, it had been refined into a toolkit for identifying and documenting judicial prejudice, now used by watchdog organizations nationwide. Judges who once felt insulated by tenure and obscurity were now subject to transparency. One headline from the Washington Post read, "From Red Folder to Reform, How Jasmine Crockett Gave the System a Mirror." This wasn't about vengeance. Crockett never once called for Stones to be disbarred. Her focus remained on prevention, on ensuring that no judge, regardless of prestige, would ever again laugh away a civil rights case without consequence. The system hadn't healed, but for the first time in a long time, it was moving. In the aftermath of the firestorm, as headlines faded and news cycles rolled in, Jasmine Crockett quietly returned to the work that mattered most, not the interviews, not the speaking fees, but the unfinished business of reform. She declined every major network's request for a televised special. She turned down book deals and panel invitations framed around celebrating the moment. She wasn't interested in being memorialized. She was interested in momentum. Her focus narrowed to a single legislative goal, the Federal Judicial Transparency Act, a proposed bill that would require real-time public reporting of federal judicial conduct, rulings, reversals, sanction rates, and patterns of behavior in civil rights cases. No more closed-door biases masquerading as procedure. No more immunity through obscurity. The bill was radical only in how long it had been needed. She called it sunlight for the bench. At Harvard Law, she stood before a packed auditorium of students, many of them women, many of them first generation, many who had watched her courtroom clip like scripture. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't bask in applause. She stood behind the podium like she had in court, steady, principled, unshaken. I didn't destroy a judge, she said. I woke up a system that had been asleep in its privilege. The room went silent. And then, like a tide rising, the applause came. Not loud and rowdy, but full of respect, of weight, of promise. Not for a celebrity, not for a viral icon, but for a woman who had turned years of dismissal into a blueprint for dignity. As she stepped down from the stage, the students rose, one by one, until the whole room stood. Jasmine didn't wave. She didn't smile for cameras. She simply nodded once, placed her notes in her satchel, and walked down the center aisle, flanked by a generation now standing a little straighter because of her. She left behind no slogans, no banners, no entourage. Only evidence, only courage, only the quiet, enduring truth that the strongest legacy isn't made of power. It's made of what you choose to do when no one thinks you can. And she had chosen to fight, not for herself, but for every voice that had been told it didn't belong in the room. Not every legacy is carved in stone. Some are written in silence, in small, steady acts of defiance that echo long after the moment passes. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to break the system to change it. She only needed to reveal what it had become, through records, receipts, and resolve. Her strength was not in spectacle, but in showing that the law, when wielded with conscience, can still be a sword for the voiceless, not a shield for the powerful. This story, though drawn from publicly documented events and public roles, is a reflection, a meditation on what happens when courage meets preparation in a room built to silence both. The people and events depicted here serve as symbols of something far larger than one courtroom or one judge. They represent the tension between tradition and transformation, and the truth that dignity doesn't always roar. It sometimes enters quietly, opens a folder, and rewrites the rules. And so the question is no longer whether change is possible. The question is, who will carry it forward? If you've ever felt dismissed because of your age, your gender, your skin, or your story, let this be your reminder that no one owns the room more than the person who walks in with truth. Stand up, speak with precision, build your folder, because someday, somewhere, someone will laugh at you too. And when they do, make sure you've come prepared to change everything. Thank you for staying with us through to this moment. It means more than you know. Every second you gave to this story is a reminder that justice begins with listening. If it moved you, let it live beyond this screen. Like the video, subscribe to join us for what's next, and turn on notifications so you never miss a voice that deserves to be heard. And please, we'd love to hear from you too. What part of this story stayed with you? What made you stop, feel, or reflect? Leave a comment below, because when we share what matters, our voices don't just speak, they connect. They make change.